Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. It has been 250 years since the founders declared our independence from the tyranny of English rule. And while this year should be a celebration of the promise of America and a reflection on the struggles of marginalized groups, we're instead witnessing the erasure of those fights that really helped build the American experience. One such moment that really demonstrates this is the Trump administration taking down pride flags at the Stonewall Inn in New York, which, of course, is a vital landmark in the fight for equality in the LGBTQ plus community. I am so pleased to have Michelangelo Signoril join us again. He is a host at SiriusXM Progress, the author of the Signorile report on Substack, which you should definitely subscribe to. And he's joining us now to talk about what this means for the LGBTQ community and so much more of what's been in the news. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for having me again.
Great. Well, I understand that you were actually out there for a protest, and I think we have a photo from your time there. Can you just talk with us a little bit about what the scene was there, what the mood was, and maybe just give us a little bit of the history of the Stonewall riots and why they're still important for us to talk about and remember today?
Sure. Well, the Stonewall Inn is right down there in the village at the sort of intersection of so much of the gay liberation movement going back to the 1960s. And of course, the Stonewall Inn was where the riots occurred that are seen as the symbolic beginning of that movement. Right across the street is a tiny park, and that park is a place that was designated as a national monument by President Obama in 2016, commemorating, of course, those Stonewall riots and that beginning of the movement. And, it's very interesting because the pride flag is something that was created by Gilbert Baker, an activist during the beginning of the early gay liberation movement. And he created it as something he wanted to go universal. He wanted it to be something that, became everywhere, just ubiquitous. And so he never cared about it being licensed or anything. He just wanted everybody to take it, steal it, and use it. And what's really interesting about this, and what's interesting about everybody going down there and really being angry about the flag being removed, is that over the years, the flag sort of became, because it became so repurposed everywhere, became commercialized, it became corporatized. It was in Target, it was in people, it was in the logos of corporations. And it kind of got this, people kind of got like this, okay, I'm done with the flag kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, okay, the flag, it's kind of like just been totally usurped. And, so I think a lot of people, particularly activists, the flag wasn't something they really cared much about, but how things change, right? How symbols become so important. That flag had been there for the last several years. Obviously, the monument was created by President Obama, but I think the flag came later, a few years later. And when it suddenly went missing, some people in the Stonewall Inn, some of the employees saw it across the street. They just saw a missing flagpole. And boy, suddenly, the love of that flag became just once again something that people were expressing, just because of the audacity of this administration to go and take it. And so people decided, no, we're putting it back. And some of the elected officials in New York who gathered there were part of rehoisting the flag. And it was a lot of gay and lesbian, bisexual politicians, but also some of our members of Congress like Jerry Nadler and Dan Goldman and others. And they went there with the intent of putting up the flag. A couple of nights before, the Parks Department, the Interior Department, put up an American flag.
Mm.
And Governor Hochul was down at the Stonewall Inn, and she was saying, look, we're not going to take down the American flag. We're going to put up the pride flag with the American flag, right? We can have both flags. And that kind of was the plan. And that kind of was what everybody was going to do. And so I went down there to see what was going on and to interview people and cover it. And it was really in the spirit of Stonewall because people were angry. The
Yeah.
anger among the people in the crowd was unbelievable. I mean, I interviewed people who just, they were infuriated and they were like, we should not have to do this again. Why are
Right.
we even doing this? Why are we even here? And so there was a lot of anger. And then it was a lot of kind of chaos because the flagpole that was there uh, had the American flag on it, and the plan was to sort of hoist a rainbow flag, a pride flag, right under it, and then they sort of were doing it by, I don't know, wrapping the pride flag around a pole that would go sort of alongside the other pole, and they did that, but people were angry in the crowd that the pride flag was lower than the American flag and that it wasn't really on the same flagpole, that it was sort of just attached. And so there was a little bit of pandemonium and people were yelling and there was a lot of, take it down. People were chanting, take down the American flag. So then I saw the American flag suddenly coming down and I thought, well, I don't know what's going to happen here and, what could go on. After some of the politicians had sort of hoisted that pride flag, what happened, I would come to learn, is that some people jumped over the fence and just cut off the cord for the American flag, put the pride flag on the same cord, on the same pole, and raised it to be just like 1 inch above the American flag. And so they pretty much were overlapping. And then that's kind of how it went. I mean, activists just came in and took over and said, no, we are not standing for this. And then everybody was fine with it. I think for that little minute there, though, a lot of the politicos, a lot of the members of Congress, they kind of scampered away. They were like, I don't think we want to be part of this. But it really turned out great. And
Right.
a lot of them were down there, speaking to press, doing interviews. And so far, the flag is still there.
Well, that's kind of the story of so many civil rights movements is that it's the activists that lead the way. Politicians are more risk averse and they're wondering about, are we going too far? But it's the activists that put themselves on the line and that, really fight for the principles that are at stake. I was really struck by, the fact that we're at a place in our country where, Gallup polling has shown that support for LGBTQ rights is very high and it crosses party lines. Support for same sex marriage is high, for basic civil liberties and rights for LGBTQ people and couples. And yet, this administration really does seem to be waging war on those rights. I mean, Trump told us, I believe in his first campaign, oh, I love the gays. There were gays for Trump. He was just targeting the trans community. But it does seem to me that that fight is being expanded and not just symbolically here. And I'm wondering how you see that as somebody who has, been so at the forefront of this fight for so long.
Yes. I mean, in his first administration, he did a couple of things to make it appear that he was supporting LGBTQ rights. He rolled out that rainbow flag at a pride flag at an event. He had come out in support of those who had been affected at the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. But he couched it as an anti-Muslim thing because he made it like we're going to protect our LGBTQ community from these terrorists, right? And um, person who had engaged in the attack. And so, he was pitting communities against one another, but most LGBTQ people understood that that was all a facade.
Mhm.
This community, this voting bloc has been the most anti-Trump, and in fact, it dramatically rose in the 2024 election. I mean, you're talking about a voting bloc that in the 2024 election was something like 5% of the electorate, 5 to 7% of the electorate that voted 80% for Kamala Harris. So, I mean, when we saw other groups going the other way, maybe losing some people,
Mhm.
right? Other minorities, this minority went that way. And it was because we knew that the attacks on the trans community were attacks on all of us
Right.
and that nobody was going to, stand for that. Now, Trump is tapping into this backlash in his base. And, this kind of idea that, the same thing with DEI, right? That people are getting some sort of special treatment, that people are somehow affecting their lives, that, it's what authoritarians do, stigmatize and attack minorities. And, we worry that for some of those people, that sort of becomes ingrained and it makes the fight more difficult. And there's some research showing that, there's been some slippage of support, even as we see huge support for LGBTQ rights. There has been some slippage, or at least this idea
Mhm.
that people feel they can say publicly what they believe when they previously felt they couldn't or shouldn't say things
Uh,
that were offensive.
and we've also seen that there are a lot fewer LGBTQ characters on TV than we did a year ago, and it seems to me that that is the Trump effect. And it's I think that it's not a subtle, it's not an insignificant thing, because a lot of those representations, the fact that you could be comfortable and say, oh, I like that show, right, I get it, this is not something that's awful and against my morals, these are just people, these are people that I enjoy seeing. When you start erasing people from culture and you start erasing history, which is an active campaign for the Trump administration, and of course, not just for the LGBTQ community. We're seeing this with removing placards referring to slavery. We're seeing a removal of calling the killing of Emmett Till a racist killing. We're seeing an erasure of reality. And it's broad based, and it's really an assault on our history and on who we are as a people. And I'm wondering where you think all of this ends with the Trump administration. How far can we expect them to go?
Well, you get to such a great point, and you're so right about um, images on television and these exhibits, and a lot of it corporate cowardice, right? The industries have been afraid. We're seeing in this whole Warner Brothers, Netflix, Paramount, CBS jousting over the merger, right? I think everybody wants to be safe. They don't want to do anything. They're worried about mergers. They're worried about anything. And so um, you have this cowardice out there. As long as Trump sees that that works, that he could look at what they're doing with Stephen Colbert, look at what they're doing with CBS. As long as they see that it works, and that at least it satisfies the base, and there are cave-ins, even though some of these have backfired, like Jimmy Kimmel and like Colbert now. They'll continue. And on the issue of LGBTQ rights, I think the proof of how what the public wants versus what the companies are doing, right? You pointed to the GLAAD report showing fewer characters on television, and because they're worried about being criticized and controversial. But then look at what happened with Heated Rivalry, an enormous success,
Mm.
huge show because it came out of Canada. HBO picked it up, so HBO didn't actually produce it, they bought it. It became a massive smash hit. It broke out, to so many other communities, to the, mainstream culture, um, and it's a love story about gay hockey players, and everyone loves it, and it's just an example of how it wasn't that the public didn't want to see things. It was that the companies didn't want. They were worried about paying for stuff, and
Yeah.
worried what would happen, if what ramifications they would have.
So I've noticed both in polling and anecdotally, as the mother of two queer kids who are Gen Z, that the argument over gay rights is really over with their generation. It's almost something they don't really talk about. It's just very accepted. And that could be the fact I do live in a blue area. If I were in rural Wyoming, I'm sure things would be quite different. But there is a sea change, especially in polling, which I think was one reason why some of us were very surprised to see how Gen Z flipped. And, there was a strong support for Trump, given, the fact that they are culturally progressive. But, when it's interesting when I've had conversation with my kids or their friends, about the history of not just the LGBTQ rights movement, the women's movement, fighting for reproductive freedom. They know a little bit, they don't know that much. And, there's a danger, I think, when you just come to expect that we've earned rights and there will be no rollback. This just makes complete sense, where you don't necessarily know about the history and the struggles and people who, did go to prison and they lost their lives to fight for these rights. And it seems to me that the push and pull there is so evident with what happened at Stonewall with the flag being taken down, because all of a sudden it was very clear that we can't forget our history and it's not that far in the past. And, these rights that have been fought for may still have, we still may have many, many more fights ahead.
It's so true. And uh, if there's one thing that comes out of these moments that is a positive thing, it is to educate people and younger generations who think it's over. And I wrote a book in 2015 called It's Not Over, because there was
There you go.
this, what I called victory blindness after marriage equality, this idea that we'd won and it was all done and it was finished. And I think that happens cyclically. And it certainly happened to my generation, or I would say even the generation a little bit before me, where after Stonewall, there was an idea that, oh, we've won the right to exist and, go out dancing all night or whatever. And then the AIDS epidemic came, and then we saw how much, no, they hate us. And the religious right is very much in politics, and Ronald Reagan followed what they believed. And it was a wake up call. So I think for Gen Z, your kids, right? It's a wake-up call. It's a moment to look at the history and get energized. And that to me is one at least positive thing that comes out of this, because new generations need to reimagine how to engage in activism using the new tools, the new media, what's available now. I was in ACT UP at the time, when we were part of that wake up call during AIDS. And we use the media to make those points and get it out in the public. So I think that has to happen, and that is happening. We're seeing people speaking out, and that is one good thing that comes out of this.
Yeah. You were talking about Trump's kind of divide and conquer techniques during his first campaign with the Pulse nightclub shooting and being anti-Muslim. And then I saw firsthand him flip that on its head during the 2024 election. And Republicans kind of started this campaign during the midterms in 2022, and then it accelerated, where they actually started to join forces with some of the very conservative, Muslim activists and say, hey, we're really with you on this book burning stuff and this book banning stuff. Yes, get all of the LGBTQ literature out of your schools. Vote for Trump. He's a vote for your values, and it seemed to be a very effective campaign, especially in my
Yes.
home state of Michigan, in Dearborn, which is a heavily Muslim and Arab area that has been a really big hotbed of anti-gay activity. And that's very concerning to me because, um, during his first administration, there were so many people from the LGBT community who came out and they protested at DTW airport against his Muslim ban. They were on the front lines. And to see those coalitions start to fray is really concerning. And I'm not sure, even with the anti-Trump sentiment that has clearly grown, I'm not sure if those coalitions have really mended or if they can be.
It's really discouraging to see that certain elements of communities will be, easily convinced that suddenly Trump is for them, right? If he suddenly feeds into some sort of bias that they may have, right? And it was, I think, a classic Trump tactic, as you pointed to back in 2016. He was pitting gays against Muslims. Now he's pitting Muslims against gays, right? Or against LGBTQ people. And it is something that people, I think, unfortunately, a certain portion of the community is going to be susceptible to, because he creates this sense of acceptance that they've been accepted, right? That they are going to be treated well, that they are going to be the different ones, that they are going to be, excluded from these purges. And of course, none of that happened. And you know better than I, especially where you live, if many of those people have changed their minds and said, well, we were duped. I think some people probably don't want to admit they were duped, right? So they
Right.
don't say it. I think we have to keep putting the message out, though, and I think we have to be consistent, and make sure that we're for equal rights for everyone, no matter whether they're suddenly in a moment where they're working against us or anything that's harmful to us. We're there for everyone.
I'm Susan Demas, and thank you if you're just joining us on Lincoln Square. I am talking with Michelangelo Signorelli. He is the host of his own show on SiriusXM Progress and the author of the Signorelli Report here on Substack. I wanted to check in with you about a few other issues while we have you. And I know that you have a really fascinating new article up on the Signorelli Report, on the ties between Epstein and Steve Bannon, who, of course, has been a top advisor to Donald Trump for many years. Talk to us about the revelations in this piece and that relationship, because with all the news coming out of the Epstein files, there's just so much there. And I learned a lot from this piece.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in the Epstein files, and there's so much more that we don't know that we're still trying to find out. But as it all comes out, there's so much we've already learned, and I think a lot of stories are obviously getting less attention than others. But I zeroed in on this relationship between Bannon and Epstein because it was so deep, so connected, and so much this reciprocal relationship that was so hypocritical, because here was the globalist of globalists, Jeffrey Epstein, a billionaire, helping Bannon in his fake anti-globalist movement, right? And he was helping him to make connections in Europe as he was pushing this nationalistic, MAGA type movement in Europe. And Epstein was giving him access. And in return, Bannon was helping him, giving him advice, helping him to do a makeover, helping grotesquely to have this, child predator have a media makeover, even when he was filming him to make this potential documentary. And there were just so many text messages that were in there. And one that I think really showed something really interesting was his desire to have Jeffrey Epstein work with him to take down Pope Francis and the Catholic Church. Now, Bannon had been very public about that and have, as been the case with many of these very conservative Orthodox Catholics in the United States, they saw Francis as a reformer. They saw Francis as somebody who also was just not just reforming the church, but speaking out against authoritarian governments and speaking out against Trump. And so he was really just hell-bent on taking down Francis. And he had focused in on this book that came out in 2019, Inside the Closet of the Vatican, by Frederic Martel, a French author. It was an international bestseller. It was published in 10 languages at once. And he's somebody I've known for a long time. And so I chatted with him over the weekend, and he had explained to me how after the book came out, Bannon asked him to have lunch with him while he was in Paris, and he covers the far right and covers he's writing a book right now about the far right in Europe. So professionally, there was an interest there for him to talk to Bannon. But what he realized when he got there was that Bannon really wanted to make this ask to make a film out of his book. And he was perplexed because he said, his book is actually very pro-Francis, because the book is about the long history of closeted anti-gay people in the church, priests, cardinals, officials in the Vatican who are working against LGBTQ rights. A lot of them came in under Pope Benedict, but they've been there for a long time, a lot of them. And they're secretly gay. I mean, we've seen politicians like this in this country as well. And so the book is really focused on that. And where it's focused on Francis is how Francis was actually trying to break that logjam. And of course, getting an enormous amount of pushback. And so, he was perplexed by it, but why he would want to make the book. But my read on it was that Bannon doesn't get that nuance, that if he would make a film that would out a lot of these powerful people in the church, it would be a lot of his allies in the church, because he was working with a lot of these right wingers. He didn't get that because he was just all about chaos and disruption and trying to hurt Pope Francis. And so he, in these text messages in the Epstein files, is speaking with Epstein about getting him behind making a film about this book and being the executive producer. And Epstein, it's not clear how interested he was in it, but he did email himself a little note inside in the Vatican, in the closet of the Vatican. He sent Epstein sent Bannon some articles about the church and Bannon, and so there was an interest there. Something was going on. During that whole time, Epstein is offering his plane and places to stay for Bannon. Bannon's people say they never did fly on the plane, but or stayed at his place, but there's evidence in the files that seem to show he definitely stayed at his place. And they were going to be meeting again, and they were going to maybe talk more about the film, talk more about things. Like when it came to June of 2019, they were going to be meeting in a couple of weeks in New York. And that was when Epstein was arrested. And of course, a couple of weeks after that, he would be found dead in jail. And so what's interesting, though, is that since then, Bannon seemed to find some other rich Catholics to help him at least focus on some of the ideas in the book, because we would later see an outing campaign using geolocation data from Grinder and other sex and dating apps, and it brought down this Cardinal Burrell in Chicago, because they located him at a bar and a bathhouse and whatever. And so, even with Jeffrey Epstein gone, Bannon seemed to have at least put that idea out there. Others kind of carried this idea of trying to take down the church by going after these leaders. And it, he might have lost Epstein, but he found some others to help him do some of these things.
There, as we were saying, there's just so much within the Epstein files, even the ones that we've seen, and certainly there are millions of documents that we still have not. I've been struck. I mean, you have so many geopolitical threads here, trying to take down Pope Francis and the Catholic Church, Gamergate, Me Too, being involved in Brexit, in the Peter Thiel lawsuit against Gawker. I mean,
Right.
Epstein's tentacles are really connected to pretty much any major story that you and I have been covering for the last couple decades. I can't help but wonder, because one other theme that has emerged, within the last decade has been this trans panic that has been fostered by elites. And, as I was saying, I'm in Michigan, and so I got to see it on a local level, because there was a decades-long debate over adding the LGBTQ community to our civil rights statute, the Elliott Larson Law. And they successfully, even though there was some support within the Republican Party, they successfully were able to demonize the trans community to make sure that this didn't happen for almost a decade. And that was the start of it. We've seen just so many more damaging assaults on trans rights in the last few years, obviously from the Trump administration, but so many cruel policies that have been enacted on the state level across the country. And I can't help but wonder, there was this huge fixation on the trans community, one of the most vulnerable groups in our country, that somehow this was the great evil that we need to focus on, when we clearly had so much evil with Epstein and his associates, some of the wealthiest people, not just in this country, but in the world, doing unspeakable things to children, meddling with our politics, our financial markets, even the Vatican. I can't help but wonder if somehow there was a decision, when you have figures like Bannon, who are associates of Epstein, in pushing this trans panic as a way to say, these are the bad people, not all of us.
Oh yeah, I think the most sort of just almost perfect example of that was the Super Bowl ad during the campaign in 2024, right? In which they showed Kamala Harris supporting a trans person, and supporting trans people who were incarcerated. And, they said, she's for them, not
They,
us,
them,
right?
right.
Right. They, them, they, them. Yeah. It created that dynamic of these people who you don't really know much about, are really the evil ones, and they find the group that there's the least amount of understanding in our culture. And I think when we look at the larger LGBTQ movement, um, gay men and lesbians were there, 30 or 40 years ago, and they were demonized in that way. And a lot of that changed through the um, campaign for marriage equality. And what's, angering is that now you have a gay man who's the Treasury Secretary under Donald Trump's authoritarian administration, right? I mean, that's how much gay is just not a thing, right? But
Mhm.
um, there has been a slower understanding by the public of trans people,
Mhm.
and it is not an issue that a lot of people know a lot about. It's something that they can whip up fear about, and so they do that by demonizing them. And you're right, they then try to take the attention away from all of the truly evil things that they're doing. There are no trans people in the Epstein files. That's not in there. There aren't trans kids unless they're being abused, right? That are going to pop up in those files. The way they're going after children is truly horrific. People who are just trying to um, take care of themselves, and parents who are trying to help their own children. Um, in New York, we just saw NYU Langone make a decision that because funding was cut by the federal government, they weren't going to treat trans youth for gender dysphoria. There are people in the middle of their ongoing treatment, and what are they going to do? I mean, this is just a terrible attack, and they take advantage of the fact that a lot of the public doesn't know about it. So our job as journalists, as activists, the community, the LGBTQ community, I think, is to just continue to try to educate and bring more people out in the light, and make sure that people have a familiarity and understand, because that's what sort of kills their ability to do this. Once people are not feared by people, it stops. It stops.
I'm sure you saw the big news this morning that former Prince Andrew was actually arrested in the UK. And we've actually seen that there's been some real accountability in countries across the globe. Not so much here in the US, given the fact that our Attorney General, Pam Bondi, seems very disinterested in prosecuting anyone within the files. But I did just want to get your perspective on that, because personally, I was not expecting that.
It is unbelievable. And I just, when I woke up and saw that news, I was like, wow, there's real accountability in another country, right? And we've seen that on a variety of levels in terms of the Epstein files, but this is big.
Yeah.
Somebody who is a member of the royal family. And it also underscored how the Epstein files are a bubbling cauldron that is just going to keep blowing up. I mean, it got Iran off the front pages and the top of the news sites. If
Yeah.
the administration's, goal with all of this, focus on Iran and possible military strikes was about getting the attention off of Epstein, it didn't work. And I'm not saying they were doing that. I'm just saying it suddenly the Epstein files were back front and center. There's
Right.
real accountability happening in other countries, and it's not the first a bit of accountability we've seen in the UK. We saw the prime minister's chief of staff resign.
Hmm.
We've seen other royal families in Europe implicated, and there have been ramifications. And in this country, we've seen it with private entities, with private companies, right?
Right.
It's just, we have in the cabinet and Trump's administration all of these people who are in those files and friends with Epstein, people like Steve Bannon, right? And Trump himself, how many times is he in these files? And more that's coming out is more and more disturbing. And there's
Yes.
absolutely no accountability. We have a chief law enforcement officer, the attorney general, who is protecting them, while in the UK, they're moving forward with actually arresting people. That's the difference.
Well, where we started this conversation was, reflecting on the fact that we're in our 250th year of this country. and we fought a war against the British monarchy for freedom, against tyranny. I don't think that many of us had on our bingo card that the monarchy of Britain would be more susceptible to accountability than anyone close to our president's orbit here. And that's kind of a sobering thought.
Yeah. What have we become? I mean, look at what we've become. That we aren't standing up as the leader in the world on making sure that in a democracy there's accountability. Instead, we're out there promoting the idea of authoritarianism and modeling ourselves after Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin.
Well, Michelangelo, I can't thank you enough for taking so much time here. I know you have your own show that will be airing this afternoon, but I appreciate you stopping by to talk with us about these important issues. It's always great to hear from you. And again, please check out his show on SiriusXM Progress and his Substack, the Signoril Report. Always such great insight on both of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Always great to speak with you.
Thank you.